Well, thank you all so much for coming. Yeah, I'm really excited to be here moderating this panel. Before we start, as you know, this is about cities, satellites, and sensors. And so what I really wanted to try and get a sense for is with the increasing number of internet-connected devices, whether those are satellites, whether those are public Wi-Fi stations coming out arriving in all of our cities, what are the implications in terms of the tools that we can make, the insights that we can gather about people living in these cities, the problems that we can solve that maybe we couldn't have done before. And so, yeah, I think without further ado, I'd love to introduce my panelists to say their name, their position, and a Twitter-length summary of what they do at the company.
Yeah. Hey, everyone. My name is Joshua Ness. I'm with Verizon 5G Labs. Our job there at 5G Labs is quite literally to predict the future. 4G ushered in all of the advancements in connectivity and our ability to access data and relate to each other that is on your devices now. Gave rise to the gig economy, entire industries, and entire new types of technology that no one would have ever thought possible when 4G was released in 2010. 5G represents a fundamental shift in the way that we think about connectivity, and our job is to start to seek out those new types of technologies and ideas that will be powered by 5G and see how we can help develop those and create an entirely new ecosystem.
I'm Jen Hensley. I'm the president of Lync. We're replacing payphones with Wi-Fi kiosks all around New York City and around the world. We're, basically delivering gigabit speed connectivity to every single node in the public right-of-way. And we're doing that in an advertising-funded model, offering messaging and advertising on our digital displays, really trying to bring the value of content onto the streets and really make cities smarter and make sure that people are more engaged when they're in the public realm.
Hi everyone, I'm Janine Yoong. I'm the VP of Business Development at Mapillary. We are the street-level imagery platform for scaling and automating mapping using collaboration, cameras, and computer vision. We just launched the first demand-driven marketplace for getting street-level imagery and map data to address the needs for new maps from map makers and mobility services.
Cool. I'm Adam Maher. I'm the CEO of Ursa Space Systems, and basically the Twitter-like format is we take satellite data and we turn that into stories. So basically what we do is we take a lot of satellite data, we understand around the entire globe, put that to context so you can actually understand what's going on the other side of the world or what's going on locally and understand your world at a global scale.
Thank you. We were going with the 280 character tweets, not 140, if anyone was counting. So I'd love to start off, Joshua, with something that I've heard said about 5G, which is that it is the fourth industrial revolution. So that's obviously a grandiose way of framing it, but, and this, we'll start with you and then move to the rest of the panel. Where do you think are the areas that, thanks to 5G and also generally more connected cities and urban centers, where do you think the areas will notice the first signs of innovation?
Yeah, it's a really good question. Fourth industrial revolution. It's a really great marketing term. If you're following along from first to second to third to the fourth, if we're currently in the information age, then fourth industrial revolution really is about that connectivity age, about how we can use technology and connectivity platforms like 5G to start to make sense of all of the ways that we've created to gather data, and everyone here on this panel is working in new and interesting ways to gather data and then make sense of it. And then with something like 5G, really offers up an ability to not only create new ways of gathering data and new ways of making sense of the movement of people and of machines and things like that, but also to begin making sense of it. And so 5G in itself is simply much faster, much more throughput, and much lower latency. And when you think about it in itself, it begs the question, like, what does that mean for me? I got a question. I was giving a tour one time of our lab on 24th Street here in Manhattan. We have an active 5G network that we run testing on. and I was giving a tour to some people, and one person raised his hand, and he was like, "So do you mean if I swipe down on my Instagram to refresh, it'll load a lot faster?" I said, "Yes, it will." It's not the way you should be thinking about it. It is really going to impact industry and provide value in ways that 4G did not. And so I think that it will start allowing for things like advanced robotics, allowing for things like smart communities, allowing us to start using sensors and using computer vision to start gathering information in new ways and making sense of it in new ways.
And Janine, that's something that Mapillary is thinking about. Can you speak a little bit to how you are thinking about?
Yes, we are so excited about 5G rollouts, specifically because to kind of boil it down, what happens is we collect imagery from vehicles, and they need to go up into the cloud so we can process it and apply machine learning techniques to extract this geospatial data or map data to actually help cities do what it is they need to do for running operations or to create better maps for mobility services. And it's today, when you don't have good networks, what happens is the data is kind of stuck on the device, and you have to figure out how to get it in there with Wi-Fi networks and stuff like that. There's a lot of interesting developments in the connected car world involving chips and streetlights and all that, but like when you imagine a world where 5G is actually ubiquitous, think about all the data that can actually be pushed up really quickly to make this happen more in an accelerated way.
And one of the areas that I think this is particularly interesting, and this is something that I was hoping Jen could maybe speak to, is in the ability to create content and tailor content specifically to people living in cities with more granularity and more data than ever before. So I'm just curious if you could speak a little bit to that.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we use our Lync kiosk to provide the right information at the right time to help people get the most out of their city. That's sort of how we think about it, and that can mean letting you know that your train is 5 minutes late so you don't have to rush, or you can stop and get a beer, or a certain route is closed and you should go up 2 blocks and over 3 and you can get on a different subway route or a different bus route. Giving people that information there, and also trying to move people off of their own mobile device and make that really a one-to-many sort of screen experience, so that you're not, walking in front of traffic or otherwise distracted and in danger, but you're actually experiencing what it means to be in a dense urban environment, and you're getting what you need out of that information to make smarter decisions, to save time, to do something enjoyable. One of the most popular parts of our Lync content strategy is surfacing information about community events. There's a concert in a pocket park that you didn't even know existed, and it's from 3 to 4, and you're now going to go and see it. And so those kinds of things, I think, can really add value, and they can use information about time and temperature and location and transit schedules and emergency messaging, and they can surface that information in real time in a really accessible and valuable way.
And Adam, how does this, this is all data that's being collected by and large from the ground, and what Ursa does, and you can obviously explain this a lot more clearly than I can, but it deals with the satellite imaging of data. So how do you think about combining this lower level data with, I suppose, literally higher level data to create new products?
Yeah, so the way we think about it is, so if we look at what I do is literally we take data on the entire globe at a time. I think about a global scale here. And so one of the huge things we think about that is, if you imagine our platform, we can literally measure where every vehicle in the world is. And so how do you actually make sense of that and tell a story about that is actually one of the hardest things about this is the storytelling and the art behind that. And so when you look at, and so this is what I see with all these other sensors coming in, is now what you get when we look at places around the world, we start to say, if I see this vehicle movement happening in a city in Africa, what does that mean? Is that, there's a new factory? Is that what culture is coming in there? And so all this data that you're starting to collect on the ground brings that in and allows us to really start telling that story, that culture of what is happening here. And then what it does is it actually makes, for us, we've been doing this for a number of different industries, and what we see is we actually start to see where the correct assumptions are and where the incorrect assumptions are on the way that the people way we understand our world. And so it really brings this really cool context to us. And then, when you come back to, if you start here in like New York City, things are very connected. You see a lot of things. And I love my one example is, a lot of our customers, they've been in, let's say if you imagine like you're a new trader, you've been in the US, you go to college and you type foo. You don't even get to food on your phone. And it's already come up with, here's the suggestion for the restaurants, here's the traffic, here's all the like how to actually get there. You basically, you get outside of urban areas in the United States, you get outside of Europe, that doesn't exist for the rest of the world. And so this is where I really see this becoming this when you start mixing all these sensors together, you can start understanding the globe as a community versus just local communities having this connection.
Can you share any specific insights that you either intuitions that were either proven or disproven from this data?
I think I think one of the ones that's been very interesting for us is a lot of times as we see, so if we look at, for example, China, there's a lot of, so we do a lot of tracking as to what's the level of input of materials in, what's the level of input materials out. And so there's always, one of the things that we always, and it goes both ways, is there's a lot of theories on, is this the Chinese government, bringing in, let's say, a new commodity and trying to manipulate a market, or is it the other side of it? Is it just, there's actually a demand going on there? And we've actually seen cases in both directions over the years of, there was lower demand than expected, and what was happening is maybe these were just long-term contracts that were being fulfilled, and by actually being able to see where that is going, in the context of it, you can really understand, like if you're from a trading standpoint, you can understand that. Or in other cases we've done, so we have looked at, so for example, like you can actually see quite a bit before things happen. So for example, we had one where, there was a number of militants in Libya. There's a lot of fights over those oil wells, and being able to understand like, when are they actually operating? When are they not operating? Who is in there? We've done that for media organizations before, and it's a really interesting story because, it's much more complicated and nuanced than a simple story is.
Yes, I just want to jump in also to highlight the importance of storytelling when it comes to this output from sensors. So we work with lots of folks who use satellite imagery and are able to look at things from the sky and to tell you, for example, like, that this crop is going to be so and so much because of whatever it is. And what I think that we have learned as like sensors proliferate from the ground is you can actually start telling richer stories when you combine everything that you're learning from this vast variety and range of sensors. Yeah. So we've worked with people who are like, well, I feel like Malaysia, where I grew up, and I remember driving like not as a child, but sitting in the car as a child and looking outside from where I was from the vehicle and seeing how oil palm plantations started to replace rubber tree plantations. And 20 years later, I have somebody saying, well, from the satellite imagery, we can kind of tell that something's changing, but we really need ground level information to understand how the crops are changing over time. And folks who want to understand how cities are changing from road perspectives, you can actually do some really interesting mapping of road network from the sky. But if you're interested in understanding exactly what signs you're looking at from the ground, the combination of the stories that you're getting from these different vantage points, I think, really tell a full story of what's happening.
Yeah, definitely. You have to know, so especially like if you think about the commodity trade, if you're looking at, let's say, the oil commodity trade, and you just say, here's how much oil the world is moving, but you don't know who actually owns that particular stock of oil. Like, depending on who you think owns it, makes a big difference in the story as to, is this, what is actually happening in the world. And once you actually know, have people on the ground figure out who owns that store, it makes, you can really understand, is Shell doing well, or is manufacturing doing well, or is this just stockpiling? And
I think the interesting thing about where we are today in relation to this issue is that the availability of real-time data, the availability of data that you can process in real time, kind of as it's being generated, gives you an edge in understanding what those stories are and how to think about them in a much more immediate and fast-paced and kind of actionable time frame, which is something that hasn't really been as available, I think, previously.
Yeah. the ability to take those large amounts of data and then with other types of supporting technology like edge computing, being able to Jen's point, have those massive amounts of data that otherwise would be limited by traditional wireless communication methods, being able to crunch those numbers almost locally. We're not talking about a cloud server farm that is on one of the coasts or far away, but you're able to actually have almost software-defined, almost infinitely upgradable supercomputers that could be located as close as on the sidewalk. Being able to process that data and then using 5G, be able to deliver that fully processed data and graphics to a device and be able to actually understand and make sense of that story in near real time.
And then the other side to that, in my mind, is we have all this new access to data and we have all these new methods of collecting data. And so an interesting question becomes, how much of this data should we be collecting? What of this data is helpful? And so I'm curious to hear sort of each of yours perspective on how do we think about privacy? How do we think about what is needed to build these insights? How do we think about what we are collecting, what we should be collecting, what we might not know would be useful one day? It's a broad question, I know, but...
I mean, from my perspective, we provide Wi-Fi services to 7 million people through our New York City network and millions more around the world. And I think from our perspective, we have a set of sort of privacy principles that we think are really important that starts with disclosure. It starts with being clear about what your privacy policy is and making it publicly available and digestible by an average reader, also available in multiple languages, is helpful as well. I think also having a rationale for the information that you collect. When we are running our networks, we're collecting the information that we need to be able to deliver the services. And so just being limited and focused on what actually is the valuable information. And I think also importantly, really making sure that you're thinking about privacy through the life cycle of your product development. And so, when we started Lync about four and a half years ago, it was a drawing on a napkin, somebody's idea that you were going to really change the way that, public communication structures were operating. And, we wrote the privacy policy almost before we designed the equipment, and that's not a good idea. So you should have a flexible policy that you can update over time as you really, change the way that you, change and develop your product, and as you get feedback from your customers and your consumers as well. I think those are sort of really critical pieces of the way that we think about it.
Yeah. So where we're coming from is we're trying to understand the world and street scenes and what's actually on the streets as much as possible, and people who are on the streets as little as possible, if that makes sense. So I think how our approach, in addition, I think, to being extremely clear about the privacy policies and making sure that everybody who's involved is aware of what's actually happening. I think what we try to focus on also is to make sure that the technology that we're building to achieve these goals that we want to understand the world are also being deployed to protect privacy beyond what's required by legislation. So for example, in addition to building world-class semantic segmentation models for road scenes to understand whether it's a car or a cone or a traffic light or what have you, we've also built out leading blurring algorithms for faces and personally identifiable information. So when images come into our system, we make sure that your face is blurred, your license plates are blurred, so there isn't this issue as things comes up. And we have human fail-safe, so if things come up, let's get it out of there as soon as possible. Policies like that, I think, are important.
Yeah, and I agree. I mean, things for us, unlike what you see on TV, we can't see people and license plates from space. But what we,
You can't.
no, not sorry. I was supposed to point you on that.
Not yet.
So, but for us, actually, this has been an important question for a long time because we're from space. We actually work in an international space where we really don't have a strong set of regulations like you would if you were on, if you were regulated within, a communication like Verizon would be. But for us, we've also realized that the things that we measure and the things that we see around the globe do have impact, in what it is, and so we try to be, so we do try to be very conscious about we measure for a certain thing, we sell, we're truthful about what we put out, but we take a lot of time when we do put different stories out to say, okay, is this really, like, do we actually draw the right conclusion from what we saw? Because people will make, people do make fairly large decisions, and we also just look at this in general, and it's a hard question for us because do we just publish everything, or we see things sometimes where we're like, probably shouldn't publish that just because there's national policy implications on certain things that you can see from space that countries just don't necessarily want you to look at. So it is for us it's an interesting gray area because we don't have necessarily strong. We don't have regulations necessarily to really guide us, and so we have to work closely, with what we, to what we produce and what we don't say, and understand the consequences if we get something wrong.
Yeah, I think at the other end of that is almost a self-regulatory mechanism that's beginning to evolve, where we as a society have to keep our technology companies accountable. You look at Facebook with Cambridge Analytica, and then even the carriers who were selling their location data to the third parties who were then, or providing it to third parties who were then selling it to other third parties. And there was a story about that most recently, and then there was the backlash against the carriers, and they were forced to change their policies. And I think that mechanism of self-regulation, it continues to be. It continues to evolve and to be more widely understood, and it means that we are taking more of a hand in what our technology companies are doing with our data, and I think that'll end up leading to more regulation. But it means that we're continuing to stay vigilant as a society, and I think we'll continue to do so. And the way that we think about privacy and data collection and then sharing it'll continue to evolve, but our understanding and our expectations will over time as well.
I think the concept, though, of jurisdictional oversight is a really interesting one because, a lot of the companies that we're talking about operate in, across borders of states, across borders sometimes of countries or of, atmospheres.
Yeah.
And
I work in outer space.
And I think, coming up with standards that allow businesses to really continue to get the benefits of scale, of operating at scale, while also complying with, reasonable and fair and transparent standards that really protect consumers, I think is really important. And I think there's a risk, I think, currently that, certain progressive places will sort of move more quickly or try to get something going, and really we need to think holistically about what has to be in place more broadly, so that we can, so that companies can continue to operate effectively.
And then on the other side of that coin is kind of the potential for what these new technologies can enable. And so I'm curious, in the 5-10 year span, whatever we're thinking, what do you think are the things that these connected cities, connected planet even, what do you think are the things that we might start to see to emerge from that?
Well, I think especially when you start thinking about ecosystems of devices that we're going to end up having, it's going to be very easy for companies to create profiles and begin to predict behavior. I was listening to a podcast, I think it was, it was an NPR podcast, I can't remember the name of it, but it was Is My Phone Actually Listening to Me? Because we've all been there where you're talking about a pair of shoes with a friend that you've never purchased that brand before, and then you open up your Instagram and then you're being advertised that pair of shoes, and you're like, what just happened? That's happened to me. And the answer in that particular podcast was that no, your phone is generally not listening to you. It's just that based on the information that we have available now, it's very easy for companies to create very detailed profiles of you. Now you start introducing a broader ecosystem of technology, all of which will be connected to a network, and based on the way that you like your thermostat, and based on the items that you have in your refrigerator, based on the routes that you take to work and home, the type of profiles that are created for individuals that can then be sold to advertisers, it's going to get I don't know if scary is the right word. They're going to get very detailed and very good. And so I think the ability to deliver products and services to people in real time at the time that right when they need it, almost like just-in-time delivery of advertising, being able to send you something meaningful to you, I think that's something that will likely evolve.
And the same question, I guess, when you think about the New York City links, you have this data around potentially where people are, how they're moving, and it could affect.
Yeah, I mean, that's not data that we collect from links. We're providing, we use, hash MAC addresses to provide Wi-Fi services. So we're not tracking people as they move around the city, and we're not collecting PII really at all and certainly not to the extent that some of the carriers are. We ask for an email address when you sign up for Wi-Fi, but I think there's a perception, right? And there's kind of a perception that people are always being tracked and that something somewhere knows kind of everything about them. And I really think that is something we're grappling with, of like how much of that is helpful and is sort of accretive to my life, but how much is not. And, for us, we really use, we don't target individuals in public spaces. We're using, we can guess that if you're by Penn Station, you're probably a commuter and you probably want to know the transit times. Mm-hmm. That's not super deep thought, right. But it's super helpful to people and it really reaches people where they are. And so I think some of those standards and approaches are things that end up being kind of, you feel like it's targeted to you, and maybe that's a good thing, but really there's a lot of people just like you interested in the same kind of information, and that's going to come up in a way. And I think really the question that we all have to ask is, does it make my life better? Does it improve my experience because of this? And what do I know about what I'm giving up or sharing in order to get that level of information?
Well, from my perspective, in the near term, looking at my company and our products, if we think about a better world in terms of better mobility services from more accurate maps, but if you kind of stretch out a long view of what happens when you really have all these sensors all over the world combined with better satellite imagery and better networks, getting all this, you really think about in a future where you have this living, breathing representation of what the world could look like from your sitting room, for example. And there was this really interesting article a few months back, written I think in Wired, where some writer was describing this vision, and I think he called it mirror world. It sounds like some kind of sci-fi term, but the idea was that he had a friend who had written a book or something like that about Southeast Asia, and he said, "Wow, when did you visit? It was so vivid." He was like, "I've never been there." Looked on Google Street View and had a really good idea of what it's like. And when you think about this, actually bringing people closer together by building understandings of different cities in the world, I think that's a really exciting future. I'll just end with my kid has a book called The World We Live In, and it basically highlights another kid who lives in Iran or Italy or or Singapore, and for a 4-year-old to look at these stories and to really start building a better understanding and commonality, I think is really important, and I hope that this is the sort of thing our technology can bring.
Yeah, and I guess from my view over the next 5 to 10 years, I mean, partly in our industry, there's literally hundreds of new satellites being put up there, and that's going to go from this idea of you're talking about updates of the globe, today it's kind of a weekly basis down to hourlies. And so, what I look at this in from a globe perspective and saying instead of today, the map is like you were saying is kind of it's a very static place, and it's only locally active in cities and areas. And so now what this is doing, what I see over the next 5 to 10 years, is now we have a global living map where all sorts of parts of the world are all the time updating, because you can think about the expectation as you have more connectivity and more units. How many of us have looked at our house on Google Earth and said, "Oh, that's how old is that?" I built something there before, and so now we're we already get a letdown and disappointment because we're so used to this piece of information, and so that's what I see in the future is just this becomes a living map where you can start seeing things, and then with the things that are the ideas that are happening in AI, all the different computers. When you actually look at that image of yourself, your house on Google Earth, you may be able to actually do an analytic yourself It's kind of this idea of, was it, probably 10, 20 years ago, no one thought about doing photo editing themselves. And now how many people in this room have Photoshop, some version of Photoshop and actually do their own digital editing. And so I see that as the same thing, as you look at all these sensing technologies that are going on, the platforms we're building, you'll be able to get to that point in a decade from now.
Thank you. Thank you all. And I'd love to open it up for some Q&A as well. We have a few more minutes, yes.
Hi, I'm Dom. Thank you all for your time. I'm wondering if you could all... Hi. Hello. I'm wondering if you could speak to the potential effects of 5G and beyond on our ecological situation, whether it be how it's affecting us or the bees or the birds.
Yeah, that's a great question. It's a popular one. I will preface everything by saying I'm not a doctor. I'm not able to provide any sort of medical analysis or anything like that. But the way that current millimeter wave technology operating at the 28 and 39 gigahertz spectrum is being propagated is compliant with FCC regulations and the Department of Health. Beyond that, it is a really good question, and it's something that we as a society should continue to ask and hold the companies that are providing those services accountable. I wish I was able to provide more information and a better insight into that and actually answer that question for everyone here. I think the way that we think about communications technology does continue to evolve, and I think it is important and it's crucial for all of us to continue asking that question and to be paying attention to its effects, not only on us as people, but to other species around us, not only in how will millimeter wave affect weather satellites, which is something that's currently under debate, but how it will affect navigation of a species that rely on sonar. I don't necessarily know, but I think we should continue asking those questions and holding the companies that provide those services accountable.
So maybe to add to that one, this has actually been something that's really, I've had my eyes wide open as I've been doing this for a few years, looking at the world from space, in that, I was thinking, it's interesting because this year is 50th anniversary of the moon landing, and one of the most important pictures for, the environment was the Earth rising picture. That was one of the most important ones that got, started a lot of these movements. And so one thing that I've noticed is as we've been looking at the world and we start understanding things, we have done projects where we have looked at illegal, we can actually see the effects of illegal fishing and measure what's happening. You can start understanding what's happening to the world's oceans. You can start seeing deforestation. You can start seeing, there's a large debate about here, about not having more oil drilling here in the United States. But then that oil's got to come somewhere, and you see like the difference in regulation in the U.S. versus other parts of the world, and you compare it. And so what I've started to see here, it's been really interesting for me because it's actually started to like change some of my thoughts and opinions and how we think about the world we live in and what our effect is, because I'm actually seeing it. And so I think that's one of the things I hope that comes out of what we're doing. Is we've seen there's projects we've looked at in everywhere from Africa to Asia to the U.S. and you could really see what the human impact is. And I think this having this kind of living map where you start to see this again, kind of like when the first time we saw the Earth from space, I think that will start to change opinions. It definitely has started to really change my mind a lot in the way I think about different policies.
So I was wondering, like Accenture had a report like 2 years ago. They were saying that the race to 5G, that they think China has already been investing, and the government helping them subsidize the cost of. They're so far ahead of all the 4 U.S. telecoms. Does the government now finally putting Hawaii or whatever, however you pronounce it, like on the blacklist like a week ago? Does that help you guys as majorly? And obviously the whole thing is you guys are all talking about like all the great things, robotics that are going to come from it. But if we think we don't have privacy now, they're saying like Hawaii could possibly be spying on us, and that's why the government's so fearful of that. So what's your opinions on this stuff? I mean, obviously you work for Verizon, so
Yeah.
I don't know what you're going to say, but
So the question being about Huawei and about privacy concerns. It's important to understand. So Huawei and other types of companies like Ericsson and Nokia and Samsung, they produce the equipment that carriers use to provide connectivity services. And the idea being that Huawei having so much investment from the government, because the government in China is so heavily investing and subsidizing those industries, that there might be the potential for backdoors to either be pre-installed or to be installed with a software patch, something that happens over the air that no one even knows about. So that is a fear, and that is the reason why the U.S. government and some other governments around the world have either not used Huawei equipment or now are stopping their own existing domestic companies from providing technology services to companies like Huawei. And they're not the only one that is experiencing these effects. I will say that it is Verizon as a carrier doesn't use any Huawei equipment in our network here in the United States at all. The reason why it's popular and a popular choice is because they cost less. And a lot of that is because the government is able to subsidize that. And so the challenge is then for rural carriers as well as carriers in emerging markets, what recourse do they have? They want to build out these networks and be competitive as quickly as possible. And so it really comes down to, I've used this word accountable a lot of times today, but it comes down to the people holding those companies and governments accountable to using equipment that doesn't pose those threats. Our vendors are Ericsson and Nokia and Samsung, like I mentioned, we've worked with those vendors for a very long time and don't feel that threat exists there. Did that answer your question? That was
yeah, I guess. But like, is there a big race for 5G for like being like the next? Like, obviously, the U.S. has always been in the last 20 years.
Yep.
The controlling, like the most innovative with like all the crazy startups that have
Yep.
like become successful. But obviously, it seems as though China's like trying, like that's the next like whatever Cold War is like tech or something.
If you read the news, that's exactly what it sounds like. China does subsidize their 5G, and a lot of countries do. We are doing our best as a domestic carrier to be first with 5G, because being first does have economic impact and ramifications. We were the first to turn on in the U.S. The U.S. was the first to turn on 5G commercially in cities and make it available to consumers. And we're hoping that does attract investment's the wrong word because people think about money, but we want people to come and build with us. And the U.S. is no different. Verizon is no different. We have a program right now where we're offering $1 million to a company if they want to be some of the first to build on 5G and if they have a really interesting idea about that. And so the race is real because there are real economic impacts that come along with it.
Jen, thank you. I'm Angelica. I had the pleasure of hearing you maybe 4.5 years ago when you guys first launched Lync, so it's fantastic. So public consumption and access of media, this is New York City. How have you guys filtered or had some censorship where users are actually accessing porn on Lync, if that's even still happening?
Yeah, I mean, when we launched Lynx, there's an integrated tablet into each of the kiosks. And when we first launched, again, with the sort of early product development, we thought, bringing the internet to everyone means you need a browser on the tablet. And for those of you who've used Lynx, you don't need to log in to use the tablet. You simply engage with it and you can do what you want. And at the time, that meant you could surf the internet, which seemed like a good idea, but was not. And so we actually removed the browser shortly, a couple months after we launched. So you can't, it's all whitelisted and you're just able to get city information and social services through the tablet, as well as making phone calls and using map features and things like that. But it's all a heavily curated experience on the tablet. On the Wi-Fi that we offer, again, we're running gigabit speed Wi-Fi to every single Lync unit, and that's available for people for free on their phones or other mobile devices. And we're not controlling that traffic at all. well. And we actually do believe that when you offer free internet, it means free internet, and people should be able to do what they want on their own mobile devices. We haven't gotten, our community complaints went from lots to 2 on average per month that we're getting now. So, I think it was the right decision for the product, definitely the right decision for the city and for our users. And, I think today it's a much more matured product.
I think we have one more question.
So another Jen question. So when the devices went in my neighborhood, there were probably 15 of them within a block of my apartment. And I watched this little battle take place that I had nothing to do with. Somebody started sticking Post-it notes at the very, very top of all of the units. And then a truck would come around at about 11 o'clock at night with a long stick and take the Post-it notes off. And then the next day, the Post-it notes would be back.
Yes.
So finally, I'm a journalist, so I'm curious. It turns out that what the Post-it notes are covering is a camera at the very top of the unit. So.
Yeah.
A, where are we on the battle of the Post-it notes? And B, what's the policy around what the camera captures and who has access to that information? And obviously, facial recognition would be the big question.
Sure, obviously. So that's a lot. But first, we don't do any facial recognition. We have about 1,853 kiosks deployed throughout New York City, and we have about 50 cameras, 50 cameras currently activated. Those are used for vandalism. The information is stored in, in an unaccessed sort of secure cloud-based system. And if there's an incident with one of our links, we can review the footage within 7 days. It's all destroyed, actively destroyed after 7 days. And if nothing's happened, we all just move on. If there was an incident, then we are able to pull that footage and use it to figure out what happened and work with the police. But that's really the extent of the camera. I think when we first launched Lync, there was an expectation that there would be a lot of, analytics that could be processed on the links to be able to understand what's happening at streets. That evolution has happened in other ways. So that's not a use case that we're actively engaged in or currently pursuing. All of the information about our camera policies is in our publicly available privacy policy, which is on our website, on the city's website, and we adhere to those pretty strictly. We also provide a transparency report every year so people can see, what we've used how we've disclosed whatever camera footage has been useful for those kinds of events. But no, we take it very seriously. But I think people, there's a person, I think, who has endless amounts of sticky notes and
Free time.
yeah, and that is like a hobby of his. So it's it's New York, and so I think that may persist for some time. But we're happy to have him in and chat with him about our privacy policies and come to a reasonable, stay if we can. But
You know what he looks like.
but yeah, I know we do too. Twitter knows too. So
Thank you, and thank you to the panelists as well.
thanks everybody.
Thank you.